Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream. We have not one but two special guests this evening. But as usual, I will start off with a quick rundown on some of the news stories. We're busy preparing for the council elections. I've just about managed to move the cardboard boxes in my study here, so you can't quite see them. Well, almost you can't see them. There's a few popping out here and there. We've got leaflets all over the place. We've got forms and all sorts of paperwork, but it's going well. I say we're aiming for an amazing number of candidates in the election, far more than we would ever have thought possible. So our candidates are busy getting their paperwork in at the moment, and already some of them are campaigning in different areas as well. Right, so what's been in the news? I'll rattle through a few things quickly. But the BBC reported a bill that's been passed in Florida, and the BBC described it as the Don't Say Gay bill, which is a sort of pejorative term for it. That's a term that people use when they try and mock it. So the BBC obviously uses that term to demonstrate its own bias. But this bill has been passed in Florida, and it says there's to be no teaching about sexuality and gender identity for the first, 4 years of primary school, first 4 years of primary school age, which I think is a pretty modest proposal, really. So not until they're, I don't know, maybe eight or so, that you start talking about sexuality and gender identity. I mean, that just seemed, I would, maybe even more strong views than that. But anyway, that's the law that's been passed. And the BBC mocks it in its headline as the Don't Say Gay bill. How silly. They won't even let you say the word. How silly is that? But of course, it's not about saying the word. It's about teaching concepts and ideas that children can't understand at that age and are also going to be harmful to their development. So that was one thing that popped up in the news. I see there's moves in England and Wales about changing the marriage age, moving it up to 18. And there's been talk of that in Scotland as well. That will be interesting, won't it? What do I think about that? Well, I'm not particularly sure. I'd advise people to get married at 16. But remember, what's happening is the marriage age is going up and the age of consent is effectively going down, which for anyone that believes that sort of marriage is the proper context for sexual relations, then the law's very much moving away from that principle. It's very much heading in the opposite direction. Anyway, we'll see how that develops. What else? Another thing to do with ages, and a human rights lawyer in Scotland has said sending under 18s to prison is it's against their children's rights, which is not against the letter of the law. The letter of children's rights says they can't have the death penalty, but they're saying it means they can't be sent to prison. So see the way it's going. The age of criminal responsibility increases. Can't be sent to prison until they're 18. You're not really responsible for your actions until you're 25 because your brain hasn't really properly developed. You see which way it's always drifting? Because really, they don't believe anyone's responsible for their actions. They don't think anyone deserves punishment for doing things wrong because it's never really their fault. It's always something's happened to them, some bad experience, or it's someone else's fault. So they actually don't think anyone's responsible, and they're incrementally moving that, manifesting that view in public policy. So that's happening in several directions. And the last thing I was going to just mention quickly was the refugee situation with Ukrainian refugees. Now, one of the main advisors to the UK government on immigration and refugees in particular is a man called Paul Collier, who's written a couple of books that I've read, one of them about refugees. It's very, very interesting. One of his main points is that often the best way to help refugees is to help them in a neighboring country and then enable them to move back easily when it's safe to do so. So that reduces the culture shock, the sense of sort of cultural dislocation, and it maintains a spirit of, this is a temporary thing and we're ready to go back when we can, rather than we're starting a new life here and then we'll weigh up if we're going to go back. So if people don't return to a country that's faced war or whatever, then that can be very harmful to its redevelopment. So he argues for that quite strongly. He talked about Syrian refugees a few years ago, and he said if a Syrian refugee got to, say, Britain, compared to one that was in a refugee camp next door to Syria, the one in Britain had 137 times as much spent on them. And he said that can't possibly make sense. If there's resources available, that should be spread evenly throughout the refugees to try and improve all their experiences. So the situation in Ukraine, I think some of the surrounding countries are getting saturated. So there could be a case for refugees moving to countries such as Britain. But it just made me wonder, because initially the UK government was saying, we think it's best if we could try and house these people closer to the Ukraine. I thought that's advisor Paul Collier. That's what he's saying to the government. And that's what the government was saying. But then they've completely turned around. And I wonder if that might be a public opinion thing. That if the government said, we'd rather give money to support them in Hungary or Slovakia or whatever, would the tone in Britain have been, what an evil government, what a heartless government doing that? And then maybe it would be. So maybe the government's been pressurized into this to some extent. But basically, I hope the scheme goes really well. All these people are genuine refugees. So they need housing and helping in the best way possible. The other important thing is to allow them to work. Sometimes refugees in countries are not allowed to work. And that's disastrous. You just sit around doing nothing, in a refugee camp or whatever. That's terrible. But if you let people work, then they can have some meaning and sort of purpose, some normality in their life and their new situation. And that's what Britain is doing, which is a great thing. So that's to the good. Now, I saw something on social media. Someone put on, we're helping all these Ukrainian refugees. What about British homeless people? How much money is being spent? People trying to help them. Because you get £350 a month if you house a Ukrainian refugee. But I thought someone needs to point out to these people, if you take in a British homeless person, you get an awful lot more than that in housing benefit. So if anyone wants to house a homeless British person, do go ahead. Try and find one through various means and put them in your spare room. They could claim housing benefit. And as I say, you probably get a lot more than £350 a month. So I think whoever put that on social media wasn't really aware of the situation there. Right, so that's just a few snippets from the news. Now, our first guest of the evening needs no introduction, as the saying goes, because we have our chairman, Michael Willis, with us in Stirling. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, Richard. Good evening. Good to be back.
Yep, it's good to have you. Sometimes with the live stream, we have a little slot at the beginning where someone comes and shares a bit about a topic. So Michael is going to talk about one of his specialisms, which is demography. He's going to give us a bit of an update. Michael spoke on this at the conference. Extremely interesting. So Michael, we're all ears.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And it is really good to be back. And those of you that missed the conference, which was extremely good, I produced this very small paper called The Demographic Winter in Scotland. And since then, there's been quite there's a lot of research findings being disseminated, and there's been a growing interest in this idea of the demographic winter, that in fact, world population is declining, the growth rate is declining, and that we may have a problem. Now, the official narrative, I believe, is still that population the growth of people on the planet is a pollutant and pollutes the environment, and that we must reduce the number of people. And certainly, if one looks at the sustainable development goals of the United Nations, and everything is sort of locked into these things. If you look at institutions, corporations, they all speak about alignment with these development goals. And all children at school, they get this rammed down their throats. And they could probably, it's a bit like a creed. There's 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in amongst them is always this thing about, to tackle poverty, we need to have a manageable population. And the world, and when they do throw out figures, it's something like 2 billion. So the estimated population now is about 9 billion. And of course, in this country, we're going through this tedious census. So that will give us the sort of up-to-date figures for our country. But some demographers are predicting that it will peak at 10 billion and then we'll go into a sort of a free fall, this precipice, the demographic winter. But I believe we're still locked into thinking about people are a problem. There are too many people. And wasn't China a brave state to introduce the one-child policy? And now they're desperately backpedaling because they see their population in free fall. I mean, let me give you the numbers. I mean, we know to replicate. And the reason we're interested in this, because we're interested in families, we're interested in children, and that old-fashioned sort of love of children and nurturing of children, because it is the development of our future. This is terribly important, and so some of the figures. So to replicate ourselves, we need a total fertility rate of 2.1. So if we have 2.1 children per family, the world population stands still. And we think if, we could perhaps go below that in Europe, because the rest of the world, surely they're reproducing at a very fast rate. But I mean, India only this year went below 2. That is not a underdeveloped country. That's a rapidly developing country. And the same sort of factors that come into play, like families, the mother and father working, pressure on households, not seeing the value of children, easily available contraception has put their population into free fall. But most interesting of all is the BBC has picked up on this, and I know Richard mentioned it to me. A chap called Amal Rajan produced a 4-part series on Radio 4, and it was about rethinking population. And I think they wriggled away to say, well, we might have a problem. It might seem like a problem if the population is declining, but we can live with it. We can live with it. And he gave a case study. He had an academic from Finland on, and she said, look, the Finnish rates dropped from 1.9 to 1.35 in just under 10 years. That's a 25% drop. And one of the things she said, which really struck in my mind, had a great degree of resonance. She said that most young Finns live in a child-free environment. And they said that most girls don't actually get to cradle a baby in their arms till they're around 35. There just aren't any babies around. And that in Finland, they changed the whole language. They don't talk about childless. They talk about child-free. So they try and put this sort of positive spin on the situation in Finland. And the other case study that I looked up, I wanted to take a look at Ukraine. And Ukraine has the lowest fertility rate, TFR, total fertility rate, in Europe. It's 1.23. And in Ukraine, the abortion rate, it's the same abortion laws when it was part of the United Soviet Socialist Republic, have remained the same. Very, very liberal abortion laws, which is part of the problem in the Ukraine. But the irony of it is that Ukraine is the biggest center for surrogacy in the world, that you can finance a surrogate for 30,000, while in America it's the figures are about 100,000 for a baby, and everyone's desperate to get their babies out. So this is a trade of about 2,500 babies a year. So I point to that case study because, one, the irony, but secondly, despite this dearth of babies and the dearth of population, they're breeding babies in, through using eggs and sperm, and using these surrogate mothers and shipping them all over Europe and indeed the world. They're using these methods, and it's such an ironic situation, and that we're getting all these babies out of Ukraine. They've got sort of top priority, and they're getting fast forwarded through the passport system and the visa system. So it's a terribly complex situation. But this conspiracy to convince us and propagandize us that we have a population problem and that we have to reduce population to 2 billion is a farce. And but if you go to these institutions like the World Bank, UNFA, WHO, IPPF, they will give funds to developing countries if they implement very strong abortion policies, contraceptive policies, if they get their population under control. And they're still implementing this Kissinger protocol, where Kissinger thought fast-growing populations would destabilize the interests of America and their global companies and the availability of minerals and resources. And this was part of American foreign policy to protect their interests, was to control population. So I think the real way of looking at this is that it's a problem that Scotland's committing a collective suicide because we don't believe in a future, that childlessness and being anti-baby and being anti-life and live for today's generation is a collective mentality of suicide that doesn't want to create a future. And that is dangerous for our country, our families, and us as individuals, and a terribly sad indictment of us all. So those are just a few reflections, Richard, that I wanted to add to that paper. And you kindly published that in an excellent leaflet called "The Demographic Winter," which is available. From Scottish Family Party.
Yes, I have. We've distributed that widely. Well, thank you very much, Michael. That was informative and stirring as well. I think what you said about the culture of small families, I think that's really powerful. I think that's what's happened in China to some extent. People are just used to that now, that you only have one child, that it just seems really, really odd or demanding. People can't imagine how would you possibly cope with bigger families. Have you noticed, though, since you gave your talk at the Scottish Family Party conference, this has become quite a hot topic in some mainstream media? Hasn't it? There seem to be articles popping up left, right, and centre about it. I think we were ahead of the curve.
I think we are, Richard. Yeah.
I think there is something of an awakening on this topic, I feel. It is becoming a mainstream one. The other thing you said about Ukraine population, Russia has had population decline concerns for ages. That's been a big thing with Putin. Putin is quite anti-abortion, not for any moral reasons, I don't think. I think because he's concerned about population decline. And they've had some success, I think, in slowing their population decline, but it's still pretty bad. But China, I can't remember the figure exactly, but China, I saw some projection that was taking them down to 500 million before too long. This, pretty solid predictions from the situation we're in now. I mean, that's a very, very serious challenge for China. When they had their one-child policy, it seems like when you start doing that, it's easy to start it, but it's hard to stop it. So if China shrinks dramatically, again, that's going to be really important factors on the world political stage. If you've got Russia and China fading away.
Yeah, I mean, when we used to study economics, we always say you would analyze the situation, you'd look at the political, economic, the social, the technological, the legal, and the environmental. These were the 6 sort of variables that you would explore, especially for a company doing that sort of analysis. But underpinning it all was the demography and the population change, and certainly in terms of power, big nations, are powerful nations, and big nations create demand. Big nations can form armies. Big nations can go to war. Big nations can dominate small nations. People are power, and they are also a force for good, and they're a force for innovation and new medical discoveries, and yet we're jealous of new people. We don't know how to treat babies. Babies, are a problem, because I suppose you've got to give of yourself and you've got to make sacrifices. And I think we've become so materialistic, and we lack a vision about the sort of society we want to create and sustain. And I think the values that we're setting in society are values which, you know, are not taking us anywhere. You know, are destructive, are not inspiring.
Mhm.
You know, we have lost the plot, and I think it is a suicide. It's a sort of a death wish of a nation, and it reminds me of the last days of the Roman Empire. You know, what's happening in Europe, that we've given up. So something needs to change, and of course, the Scottish Family Party, you know, has you know, has some of the values that we need to sort of go back to.
The fact, if you look at Hungary, where they've tackled this problem head on with some very bold policies, it's made a real difference. So that's what we're arguing for. So you know, there are things that can be done to change. Right, well, Michael, thank you very much. That was fascinating. So see you back on in a few weeks.
I hope
thanks
so.
for joining us tonight. And,
thanks for inviting me. And it looks like a really interesting interviewee that you've got this evening. A lovely guy.
Just before Michael goes, I keep saying it's your last chance if you're interested in being a council candidate. We really are getting towards the very, very last chance. But if you are interested, do drop us an email, and maybe even at this stage, we could get you on the list, and you could stand in your area. Take a stand for what you believe in. Give people a chance to vote for what they believe in. So, okay, thanks very much, Michael.
Thank you, Richard.
We'll see you soon. Now, there's just a comment I'll pick up on that. Don't dismiss Putin's possible moral objections. He is a Christian. The thing that always comes to mind when I hear Putin described as a Christian, it's the quote that it's authentic. But he said a few years ago that Russian prostitutes are the best in the world. Now, you know, you can go to as many services at the Orthodox Church as you like, but someone who says Russian prostitutes are the best in the world, he's not. I think that's enough to convince me that any talk of him being a Christian isn't actually authentic. But anyway, on to our special guest. Now, in the Scottish Family Party, you'll often hear me saying that Scotland is a debate desert. We keep inviting people to debate, and the usual reaction is they don't even bother to reply. Or sometimes someone will reply, but then they won't actually turn up. So tonight we've got someone who is actually going to come on to maybe more discuss than debate, because Flynn made some comments on social media questioning some of our views and policies. So as we often do, we said, would you like to come on the live stream? And he said yes. So let's welcome Flynn. Right, Flynn, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start off with a bit about you. We had a little chat before we started. I know you're at Clifton Hall School. Where do you live? Do you live near to there?
No, I live in West Lothian.
Yeah, okay. And you're just coming up to National 5 exams.
Yep.
You confident?
Yeah, pretty much.
And what do you want to do longer term? Have you got a university course in your sights? Or?
Not set in stone, but I'm certainly interested in going to something to do with politics or around that field.
All right. Okay. Excellent. Put this on your application form. That'd be good. Now, the topic that Flynn picked up on online was about same-sex parenting and its effect on children. But we'll maybe move on to some other issues as well. Now, I mean, this is not. I built it as a debate. Maybe that was a misnomer. There be more of a discussion. Flynn was interested to discuss the matter rather than to come and sort of have a head-to-head argument about it. So on the issue of same-sex parenting, well, the Scottish Family Party view is that we believe children should be brought up by their natural mum and dad, where that's possible. We believe that's the ideal. We'd like to maximize the number of children who are brought up by their mum and dad. And the reason for that is we think that that's best for children. I think it's best for adults as well. But the main reason is that we believe it's best for children. So when it comes to same-sex parenting, our view is that that's not ideal. So that's not something we want to encourage. We don't think it's something government policy to try to encourage, because we think that's not ideal for children. Now, Flynn questioned that, and he asked me to sort of present a bit of a case about that. So just for a few minutes, I'll come out with a few things. If we had a sociologist here, a mainstream sociologist, and said, how do kids do with same-sex parents? They would answer in a flash, and they'd say, it makes no difference. They do just the same. And that's the standard view. That's like the official line within the sociology academia. Basically, that's the view. But I don't find it very credible. And here's one of the reasons. It's well established. Let's just get rid of the sort of pornographic website being advertised in the comments. Right, just brought those. That's that. If you think about someone with same-sex parents, how did those parents end up with a child? Well, there's three options with this. The child might have been donor conceived, sperm donor or egg donor. And it's well established that children who are donor conceived don't do as well in some ways, that experience emotional difficulties or whatever, compared to children with natural parents. So that's well established. Donor conceived children tend to have some sort of problems. I think those problems stem from that the child's not been brought up by their natural mother and father. So they will often say that they're missing their real mother, or they're missing their real father, or they feel they've been rejected or let down by their real mother or their real father. So the evidence says that donor conceived children don't do as well. Right. Another way that a same-sex couple can end up with children is through adoption at any age. And again, the evidence is that children who are adopted tend to have less than ideal outcomes. On average, that they tend to experience more problems through childhood and later life than children who weren't adopted, all other things being equal. So that's a disadvantage. Right, another one where same-sex couples can end up with a child is if the child was born in a previous relationship, that relationship's broken down, and then one of the parents gets a new partner, a same-sex partner, and then they become same-sex parents. Now, again, we know that when a relationship splits, that has a negative effect on the children. On average, it has a negative effect on the children. So every child with a same-sex couple has either been donor conceived, adopted, or that there's been some sort of relationship breakdown there. It has to be one of those three. And sociologists are perfectly open about the fact that all three of those things tend to lead to worse outcomes. And yet, suddenly, when they become same-sex parents, by some magical and mysterious process, there's no difference. Those disadvantages that are well documented in every other case, as soon as it's same-sex parenting research, suddenly they do just as well. Now, I think that's just not credible. It's not credible. Something else is going on there. Now, the research that claims to show that children of same-sex parents do just as well, I think there's lots of problems with it. One common problem is that the parents, the sample, are assembled as a convenience sample. They're like recruited through a campaigning organization, for example, or people ask other people with the same values. So you end up with a biased sample, and then often that the same-sex parents in the research, they know what the research is about. So if you're a same-sex parent and you know this is research into same-sex parenting, and you wanted to come out saying same-sex parenting is perfectly good, and they say to you, how's your kid getting on? You know, are they experiencing emotional problems, whatever? Then the tendency is going to be, oh no, not at all, they're great. They're fine. It's a very unreliable way of gathering data. Another problem with a lot of the research is the samples are very small. It's hard to find large groups of same-sex parents because there aren't many of them. So the samples are often too small. The academic discipline of sociology is chronically skewed politically, to the point like there's virtually no one with socially conservative views in the sociology academic world. And almost everyone shares the same progressive, liberal, secular ideology, to the extent that they see it as their mission in their academic discipline. Their mission is to advance a political agenda. And part of that political agenda is like LGBT rights, part of which would be same-sex parenting. So they see it as their mission to justify what they see as the moral good of the necessary allowing, if you like, of same-sex parenting. So there's a bias in academia, and one of the ways that manifests itself is when studies are produced. People have basically done experiments to show that this happens. So if a sociologist does some research and finds that there's no difference between children with same-sex parents and mixed-sex parents, then that research will probably be quoted by lots of other people. It will be included in literature summaries. It will be very widely circulated. When research shows actually it's found a problem, that research is cited far, far less. People don't quote it. People don't write about it in books. Other papers don't refer to it. It's not included in literature reviews. So that's a very strong effect, and it has been sort of experiments have shown that that's what happens. And the other factor in the academic establishment is when a researcher does produce research that shows that there are problems associated with the same-sex parenthood, that the children experience difficulties of one sort or another, that researcher faces persecution. I would use that word. People don't just say, oh, we think your research isn't quite right. They say you should be fired. Your university should be boycotted. Whoever published your paper should be boycotted. And character assassination, the whole lot, which deters people from being open about these things. And when you see an academic establishment behaving like that, I think that indicates that there's a big problem with it, and it indicates that it's not trustworthy in these areas. Right, I'm almost there. Right, the other thing, now just talking about that, there is research that does show negative outcomes associated with same-sex parenting, and that research is the highest quality research. It's the research with the largest samples, and it's the research where they haven't chosen people by them volunteering. They've genuinely been picked, as a random sample from a very large group. And if you look at that research, it does show problems in a lot of areas associated with same-sex parenting. I'll just run through some here from the biggest piece of research ever on same-sex parenting. So children of same-sex parents, higher rates of depression as an adult, 51% instead of 19.7%. So more than double the rate of adult depression. Suicide ideation in adolescents, 44% instead of 14%. Suicide ideation as an adult, 30% as opposed to 7%. Distant from a parent as an adolescent, 93% compared to 36%. Distant from parents as an adult, 72% as opposed to 44%. Obese, 30% instead of 14%. Obese as an adult, 72% instead of 37%. So these are not some marginal differences. These are quite substantial differences. And there's other research I could quote, but it probably wouldn't be much value in that. But a little interesting aside on that is that research also found that same-sex parents who are married, the problems with their children were even greater, substantially greater. And the picture was basically the longer a child spent with same-sex parents, the more serious the problems were that they experienced. And the last thing I would say, that's looking at it like in a sort of social science evidence-based way. Look at it more in a philosophical sense. I believe that men and women are designed to be complementary. So they're designed to form a team and bring different qualities together. And they're also designed to be like sexually attracted to each other. And within the institution of marriage, that regulates sexual relationships. So men and women are attracted, come together, have sex when they're permanently committed to each other, have a child, and then children are only born in the context of their mother and father committed to each other in a lifelong relationship. So that's more a philosophical view, and I feel that is the ideal. That's the way things are meant to be. And it so happens that the research evidence backs up my philosophical view and confirms that that is actually the ideal. So that's my case. What do you think? What would you like to?
You mentioned a lot of statistics there, and I
Uh-huh.
think it's hard to use statistics in such a hotly debated topic like same-sex parenting, because there's so much. It's almost polluted. The statistics in this situation are polluted with the sheer amount of cases and case studies and research on that. So I could throw that back to you and say that children raised by same-sex parents are 19% more likely to go on to university education. And the US National Survey of Children's Health found, and I quote, "no differences between household types on family relationships or any child outcomes." So due to the sheer amount and how divisive this topic is, it's hard to really get any leverage behind any specific statistic.
Right, that's a very good point. That's a good point. There's two things I'd say to that. You're absolutely right. There's a sea of evidence. I mean, there's lots and lots of research papers. I haven't read them all myself, but I've read people who have read them all, and they've looked at all of them, and they say the very distinct pattern is the better the quality of the research, the more likely it is to show problems associated with same-sex parenting, and the poorer the quality of research, the less likely it is to show problems. Now, I can't demonstrate that. I could read quotations of people saying that, but that's not really going to settle it. But the point you said about academic performance is a fascinating one. That is the one area where the research I was referring to, the best quality research, does show better outcomes for children of same-sex parents. Now, I came across that in the research, and I was intrigued. I thought, oh, what's going on there? Why is that? And then I think I came up with the answer. Can you think what that might be?
Surprise me.
Okay. Eugenics. Because if you've got, for example, let's say, for example, a lesbian couple, then they need some sperm and they need it from a sperm donor. So they might go along to the NHS and say, and then be referred to, say, the Glasgow Fertility Clinic, I think it's called, which is in the Royal Hospital in Glasgow. So they'll be referred to there, and they'll basically be presented with a catalogue of sperm donors, and they will go through the pages, and they'll choose someone with the eye colour, hair colour, freckles or whatever. They'll choose someone who's either musical or sporty, and they can read something they've written, they can hear a little interview with them, and they can look at what subject they're studying at university or what their job is. And there's enough information there to give them a sort of reasonable idea of where that person probably is on the IQ spectrum. And I would imagine people don't tend to go for people who they think are not towards the higher end of the IQ spectrum. So I believe that there's a selection effect because people choose donors that are likely to produce children with higher IQ. And I believe that that's very possibly a factor in the better academic performance of children in same-sex families. Now, that's my personal theory. I've never heard anyone else suggest that or say it. But to me, it seems obvious, and someone needs to do some research on it. Does that sound credible to you?
That is under the assumption that this statistic was from Scotland, which was actually from America, and the artificial insemination, other IVF routes in America, and the laws surrounding that are far different from the ones we have in Scotland. So, and in America, you're not actually able to see the subjects in which you study, in which the sperm donor studies, or which academic subjects which they perform highly in. So that's not really valid on the whole.
I think with sperm donation anywhere in the world, as far as I'm aware, the recipients select a donor. I don't think there's any system in the world where you go along and say, basically, we want some sperm. They say, right, here we are, here it is. There's always a process of selecting a donor. Well, either selecting someone that they know or selecting someone from a catalogue. So I think everywhere in the world, I think that is going to be a factor.
Yes, but it wouldn't be to the extent of academic eugenics, though, where you're actively selecting on what subject they're doing well in, and then selecting a sperm donor based off that.
I think it could be, because IQ is quite a controversial topic, but basically, there's the spectrum of IQs, and if you know what job someone does and what they're studying Are they studying at university or are they not at university? That's enough information for someone to make a reasonably accurate estimation of their sort of IQ level. And that's very significant. IQ is about 50% heritable. So that's going to have quite a significant impact on the IQ of the offspring. So I believe that could be at least part of the explanation.
Especially in this country, what would someone with a low IQ that doesn't know much about the situation have to gain from donating sperm? Because you don't get paid for it. You don't get paid for it in Scotland. So it's unlikely you would have somebody with a lower IQ and someone that isn't as academically inept.
Right. You're correct in Scotland, which is why if you go to the Royal, what's it called, Royal Fertility Clinic or whatever in Glasgow, the catalogue they refer you to is about people in Europe.
Cool.
And you do pay for it. There's the price is next to each
No,
donor.
yes, you pay for the process, but the sperm donor does not financially gain from donating sperm in Scotland.
Not in Scotland, but they don't get it from Scotland. They get it from Europe.
You are able to donate sperm in Scotland.
You are able to donate, but I think you're right in saying you're not allowed to pay people for it, but you are allowed to buy it from other countries.
Okay. Anyway, on something you said earlier, you said that the same-sex people, the children raised by same-sex couples overall have negative outcomes in terms of like social stature and relationships with their parents. And then you mentioned situations such as family breakup or adoption. That's not really considering the fact why that family's breaking up, which was most likely a heterosexual relationship, and why those children were in adoption centers in the first place, which is most likely neglect or abuse. So that's kind of pinning the blame on same-sex parents that could actually have been brought about by negative experiences with previous heterosexual parents.
Yes, that's true. If we think about the adoption situation, if a child is up for adoption at a very young age, I mean, that generally means something's gone wrong for that child. And it's quite likely that whatever's gone wrong will have, it might have a negative effect on them in later life. It may do. And just the process of being adopted, of knowing or realizing you're not with your actual parents, I think that also has a negative effect. That's not to say I don't think adoption is a wonderful thing. It obviously is, but adoption is a way of trying to rescue a situation that was even worse and replace it with something that's far better. But it's not absolutely ideal. So adoption tends to produce less good outcomes for children who've been adopted. And yet when they're adopted by same-sex parents, the sociologists are claiming, oh, no, they do just as well, which doesn't make sense to me because it's well known that adopted children in general don't do so well. But then suddenly when they're adopted by same-sex couples, we're supposed to believe that there's suddenly no difference. So
what sociologists and researchers saying that?
I think that's just a generally established fact. If you look at, I can't sort of quote individual ones, but that's not the way I'd want to proceed in any case. Because there's,
so you're suggesting that sociologists and research has a bias?
If you think about adoption research, what bias would be in play? Who is motivated to show that children of adopted parents don't do as well? Is there anyone motivated to try and come to that conclusion? I don't see any reason for any bias in adoption research.
But you were suggesting that statistics are being made up to lean towards the side of positively impacting the child being adopted by same-sex parents, when what is there really to gain by suggesting that?
By people who are campaigners for same-sex parenting, then they've got a lot to gain by it, because that fits in with their sort of political, social, whatever you call it, agenda. Because there's people of a sort of progressive liberal mindset. They think that same-sex couples adopting children is a right. That's an equality issue. That's their political philosophy. So they bring their political philosophy to bear on this issue and say it's unfair to stop same-sex couples adopting, so we must do it for the sake of equality. So if someone comes along and then says, but actually that's not good for children, then that's a bit of a spanner in the works for them. They don't want that. They don't want to hear that because that's standing in the way of their political philosophy. So they don't want to hear it. Whereas with adoption itself, I don't think anyone's got a political axe to grind. I don't think there's anyone who's particularly making political capital about the fact that adopted children don't do so well or do okay. I don't think there's any reason.
Yeah, yes,
but
that's assuming that the sociologist or whatever research you're referencing doesn't have some sort of political bias.
Yeah, I mean, you've always got to be aware of that. It's just I don't see what it is in adoption research. I don't see that anyone's got a particular axe to grind with that. Mm-hmm. Whereas with the same-sex parenting, I think there is very much. I suppose. I mean, could you imagine sociology professors having a big symposium, we all gathering together and coming to the conclusion that actually the evidence completely contradicts the ideology that we've been promoting and holding personally for the last 30 years. I mean, it's a tough ask. It's hard to imagine that happening, isn't it?
What is that ideology that we've been promoting for the past 30 years?
Well, their ideology is that basically same-sex parenting is no different.
Which people there's no legitimate research to suggest that it is, though.
Yeah, I mean, the research, the best research shows that there are problems with it. Yeah. Well, what do you think about that point, though? There's the donor conception, adoption, or relationship breakdown. All three of those things are known to lead to less good outcomes to children. That they, to some degree, they tend to harm children's life chances. And yet, it's then claimed that children of same-sex couples, even though they must have one of these disadvantages, suddenly do just as well. Do you see the point there? To me, that's just not credible.
But that could be said the same for if a heterosexual couple adopted from them. That's not necessarily that may be a statistic that's been potentially botched towards bias on the same-sex side of things. But if a heterosexual couple adopted a child that had potentially mental health problems caused by abuse, they're not going to really perform better or worse, depending on whoever they're adopted by.
They tend to. Yeah, that's the thing. Is the research I'm talking about adoption, donor conception, or from a relationship breakdown. The research on that is not based on same-sex couples. It's based on all couples. It's just known that no matter what sort of family, those things tend to be associated with problems in later life. So that's regardless of heterosexual or homosexual couples. But then it's claimed later on that when it's just homosexual couples you're looking at, suddenly these things are not associated with problems. In other words, even if same-sex parenting didn't have anything wrong with it intrinsically, even if being brought up by, say, two mums or two dads, even if that didn't actually cause any problems at all, per se, you'd still expect children of same-sex parents to have less good outcomes just because they've either been donor conceived, adopted, or been through a relationship breakdown. And that's the thing where I just don't think it adds up.
That's probably most likely just that research will just be leaning towards the more left-wing political bias on that.
Okay, well, I think we've explored that quite a bit. Is there anything else you want to say on the same-sex parenting issue, or shall we?
Not particularly, no.
Okay, let's move on. You said you'd be happy to talk about abortion a bit. I mean, do you want to tell us your take, or?
Yeah, well, I think abortion should be readily accessible to anyone that needs it, anyone that does not want to go through the pregnancy, to either for financial reasons, social reasons, or for physical reasons. They should not have to go through a pregnancy where they cannot legitimately care for that child or bring it up. And I think that abortion and the practice of abortion should be readily available for all that need it or want it.
So, okay, so financial reasons, not prepared to bring it up, don't want the child. But I assume you don't think parents should be able to kill a child after it's born. Would that be right?
No, parents should not be able to kill a child after it's been born. That's murder.
Why is that?
That's murder. Because that child is alive. That child's out the womb. It's breathing. It's walking around. It's crawling around. It can make noise. It can poop, externally.
Right. Okay. So the key things that make a human life valuable are breathing, moving, and making noise.
Well, no, but that's what you would class as life. Life does not start until the baby is effectively passing through the vagina or through cesarean section.
Okay, so just before the baby's born, you think it's sort of worthless, basically. It can be killed for reasons of convenience. You're a bit short of money, or you don't want a baby. So the baby's got sort of no value just before it's born, but then just after it's born, you're going to send someone to prison for life for killing
No,
it.
I think to say that a baby has no value before it's born is ignorant to the whole idea of pregnancy. Really, it's a huge task to undertake. And in this country already, there's a cap up to, I think it's around 24 weeks, where you cannot abort anything after that unless there's proper, serious reasons. So to say that they're worthless before that is quite ignorant, because pregnancy is a massive thing to go through. And if you cannot force people to go through for a pregnancy where they'll bring up a child in, underprivileged and impoverished circumstances where that child won't have a good quality of life anyway.
Okay, so if you're worried about children having a poor quality of life, being brought up in inferior circumstances, again, that argument could be used to kill a baby just after birth, couldn't it?
No, it couldn't, because you would have to kill a baby.
Okay, right. If we leave the law aside now, let's forget about the law. In Scotland, abortions are allowed right up to full term in particular circumstances, if there's a disability or whatever. But let's leave the law aside. So do you believe killing an unborn baby just before it's born, is that not murder?
It depends on just before it's born. I think the cap of reasonably up to around just over 20 weeks is quite reasonable. But obviously, if you're doing it a week before birth, then that would be, in certain serious circumstances, that wouldn't be the most reasonable thing to do without a proper justification.
Okay, so it wouldn't be the most reasonable thing. That's a long way away from murder, isn't it?
What do you mean by that?
Well, you're saying killing the child just before birth, so wouldn't be the most reasonable thing to do. That's quite a low key criticism,
yes, because,
isn't it?
Well,
compared to murder,
you can die through pregnancy, but you can't die. You usually won't die once that baby's out due to pregnancy. So once that baby's out, the mother is not going to have many physical consequences because of that birth. But while that baby is inside that mother, while she's carrying that embryo, she could die because of it or during pregnancy. So there are certainly legitimate reasons for someone to have an abortion up to that point.
The abortions performed to save the life of the mother are a tiny fraction of 1% of abortions. So I would say we can leave those aside. I'm talking about, well, you were talking about, in fact, abortions for what we call social reasons, because of financial reasons, or the parents don't feel they can cope, or it's going to be difficult to bring them up, or whatever. So they're the reasons you're putting forward. So you're saying killing a child just before birth for those reasons. You're saying it's undesirable, but it's not birth. Is there some sort of sliding scale, so that just before birth, that's sort of not, it's not ideal, but it's not too bad. And then I assume at earlier stages it becomes less and less serious until you get to the stage where there's no value at all.
Well, again, to say it's not too bad is also quite ignorant, because it's a massive thing to go through an abortion. It's a big decision you've got to make. But in the long run, it'd be a more positive decision rather than bringing up a child in a situation where it's not going to achieve its best outcome, or could end up in extreme poverty or in a situation like that.
I still think your argument there should justify killing children after they're born, though. If you think it's okay to kill a baby in order to save it from some negative life experiences, if that's what you believe, surely it's okay to do that just after birth as well as just before birth. I don't see the big distinction you make.
Well, no, because you could take a baby out of a situation via social services after birth. You can't take a baby out of a womb at 20 weeks and just stick it in a more affluent area.
Right, but you use the term, murder if it was just after. I mean, murder is something we normally regard as a very serious crime. I mean, a real moral evil, something that we don't condone in any circumstances. So surely if a mother, expectant mother, decides they don't want a baby, if they do want to offer the baby for adoption, if they're going to have to wait another, 20 weeks, 15 weeks or whatever, I mean, is that really justification for killing the baby? We wouldn't normally say that avoiding that degree of inconvenience, basically inconvenience and personal cost, would justify killing another human being, would we?
Well, inconvenience isn't the best excuse or the best reason to carry out an abortion. But I feel like what it really boils down to, a woman has the right to decide what she can and can't do with the body. The fetus that exists inside the woman's body. Woman has the right to decide whether or not the fetus is in her body. Therefore, the woman has the right to abort the fetus.
Right. I'd say you had a slight ambiguity there in what you're saying. You said the woman's got the right to do what she likes with her body, and the baby is inside her body. So
Yes.
do you think the baby is part of the woman's body? Is there no independent life there?
Well, it is effectively part of her body, because without the umbilical cord and without the placenta, that baby would not, be able to sustain itself and live. So yes, it is effectively part of the woman's body until it is, given birth to.
But I think biologically that's just not the case. It's a new life. It's got its own DNA. It's a new life.
Yes, it's got its own DNA, but it's biologically dependent on the mother.
But okay. So you're saying that if a human being is dependent on another, it's okay to kill it?
I'm saying biologically dependent and physically biologically dependent via connection with the umbilical cord and the placenta.
Okay, well, a newborn baby. Let's imagine we're on a desert island and the only person there is the mother of the newborn baby. That newborn baby is completely dependent on the mother, isn't it? So would it be okay to kill that baby?
That would have to be quite an extreme circumstance to have to carry out something like that, but it's really up to the mother at that point. That's quite a...
So we're talking about after the baby's born?
Well, I mean, humans would go to, any extent to save themselves in a survival situation. It's not something I necessarily endorse or support.
Yeah, this is not to survive. It's just the woman decides she doesn't want this baby. So because the baby is completely dependent on the mother, you think in that situation it would be okay for the mother to kill the baby?
But it would not be, physically attached and dependent on the mother. It would not be being fed by the mother's food that they eat. That baby would have its own life.
It would be being breastfed. That is being fed by the food.
Yes, but the baby does not purely sustain itself off breast milk.
Well, they do initially.
Well, yeah, a baby's entire diet is not breast milk.
It is initially. It is.
Well, I guess it's dependent, but it's not entirely physically dependent. Another woman could sustain that baby. It's not entirely reliant on that, its birth mother.
But the thing, we're talking about the value of human life, which I think is something of, the utmost gravity. And you're talking about, it depends on the details of by what mechanism they're getting their food. I think the value of a human life doesn't depend on the particular mechanism that they're getting the food from at the moment. I mean, at some stage of my life in the future, I might be completely dependent on other people to feed me, entirely dependent. But I don't think that will make my life of any less value, and I don't think it ought to make me more vulnerable to people arguing that we should, we could kill him off because he's dependent now. My morality is when humans are dependent, I think that should bring out in us an urge to care for them in a particular way, to protect them and care for them, because they are so dependent and vulnerable. That's the way I would look at things.
Well, yes, humans do have a duty of care to care for dependent people, whether that be elderly, whether it be born for a baby. But if you're not in a situation where you can properly be a dependent for that baby, then you shouldn't have that baby in the first place, and therefore you should go through an abortion.
Right. If someone doesn't want to have a baby in the first place, then that they shouldn't do the baby making thing. Would be the advice there. But if someone's decided to do the baby making thing and they find it's made a baby, then I think obviously they've got the responsibility for that.
Well, condoms and contraceptive pills aren't entirely 100% effective, and there's always situations where they can.
Absolutely, which is why I would say people should only do the baby making thing when they're willing to accept that the baby making thing might make a baby. Because I think it's not okay to say we're going to dispose of unwanted human lives out of convenience. Really. I believe that human life is valuable. Full stop. That's not contingent. That doesn't depend on this, that, or the other. That's just a fact. Human life is valuable, full stop. I mean, do you agree with that?
To an extent, yes.
To an extent.
Well, yes, human life is completely valuable. I would still believe you would class human life as, well, an embryo, and I think it'd be perfectly justifiable to abort an embryo if you're not in a situation to care for that baby once it's been.
Okay. If we think about the embryo, we say human life. Which of those two terms do you think don't apply to an embryo? Is it not human? Is it some other species? Is it not alive?
It's certainly human, yes.
Is it alive? Is it life? It's growing.
Well, yeah, it's alive, but the woman has the right. The woman, it's in that woman's body. The woman has the right to abort that fetus if she sees fit, and if she does not, if she's not in a position to care for that baby once it's been born.
Okay, that sounded to me as though you admitted that it's human life, but then you went on to say,
I've never not admitted that it's life.
Okay, so it's human life. So you think a person's preferences can be given more weight than the value of human life?
Well, not necessarily, but that baby isn't actually like a fully independent human as of now, and not independent as in the sense that it's not on food, but it's not an external human. It's not cutting about, crawling about the floor and that. So,
in terms of independence, so a person, on a life support machine, or a person with a terrible disability or paralysis or something, so that they've lost their independence, they're entirely dependent. Does their life become less valuable, do you think?
Well, it certainly degrades in quality, and I believe they should have the right to an assisted suicide.
But do you believe that person's life is of less value? In other words, if someone came and murdered them, would you say, "Oh, well, that's not too bad a crime," because they were in a real state in any case?
Well, that depends on whether their life value depends on how they value their life. If they're, if they're completely comfortable in the situation they're in, then they should be allowed to continue as long as they live. But if they do not want to continue in that situation, then they should have a right to an assisted suicide.
Right. Okay. So what they're going to choose for themselves is a different topic. We're talking about what other people are going to do to them. That's what we're talking about in this case. Because say my principle is that all human life is valuable. Every human life from conception to the natural end of life has got a value of one human life. And that's a very great deal of value. So it's a very simple position. Whereas you seem to think the value of human life can be outweighed by a preference or a convenience or other factors. I don't believe the value of a human life can be outweighed by those things.
It's not by preference, but it certainly can be outweighed by certain factors that would affect the human life if it were to develop in those situations.
Okay. So you're saying that in some cases it's necessary to kill to prevent people having a bad future. Would that be a summary of your position?
Well, not in all circumstances, no. But if we're going by that logic, it'd be smart to kill Hitler when he was, when he was 18 and just joining the party, rather than letting him go on to lead the country.
Now we're not talking about people who are, acting in punishment or based on someone's moral responsibility, but we're just talking about a baby who might have a difficult life, for example. But do you think it's okay to kill a human to prevent them from having a difficult life?
Well, no, not necessarily. I don't believe it would be to have a difficult life. But if that baby in the woman is going to be born into a situation where it's going to have an uncomfortable life, it's going to have an impoverished life, and it's going to have an uncertain future, then it should not be born into that life, and it's completely up to the mother to decide whether it is or not.
Right. Well, I think that's a clear summary of your position. That basically humans can be killed for their own good. If you think their life's not going to be up to some standard I'm not sure how you define that. If you think their future isn't looking particularly rosy, whereas I would think, well, what can we do to try and make it so this person has the best possible life? I mean, killing them is just not an option. We've just got to bring them into the world and do what we can to get them on the most positive path we can. Whereas your view is, if someone's life prospects are looking very questionable, looking as if they might be heading for a difficult life, then the best solution is to kill them.
Yeah, that would be forcing, your viewpoint that's forcing a woman to go through with something with her body that she wouldn't want to go through.
Right. Well, I think we've explored that very fully. I think I've stated my position. I think you've stated your position. And time has flown by. So I would like to conclude by, again, congratulating Flynn on being one of the very rare people in Scotland who will come on and talk about these things. So, Flynn, I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks
And
for having me.
sharing your thoughts, listening to what I've got to say. And I've found it interesting listening to what you've got to say as well. So we can each go away and mull over what we've heard. And maybe at some point in the future, if you wanted to come on again, we could find another topic to discuss. We said just before we started, it'd be interesting to talk about education in Scotland as well. We'll maybe do that another day. But Flynn, may I, thank you for coming on and congratulate you for being willing to do it. So share this with all your friends, see what they think. And well done. And hopefully we'll speak to you again sometime. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Good night.